Rachel Person, and I'm going to be the lucky one who gets to introduce our author. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm thrilled to be partnering with our great friends at Yaddo for this event. For those of you, perhaps our Vermont customers who aren't familiar with it, Yaddo is a legendary artist retreat right here in Saratoga Springs and a vital part of both the local and global artistic communities. Northshire's ongoing partnership with Yaddo, highlighting the work of Yaddo artists, has been one of the true joys of my professional career, and I'm so happy that we found this way to bring the series into our new COVID digital era. So thank you to Yaddo for partnering with us on this event tonight. Our guest artist tonight is Rachel Eliza Griffiths, poet and photographer, and the author of 4 previous collections of poetry, including Lighting the Shadow and Mule and Pear. Her literary and visual work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, the Paris Review, and many other publications. I had been greatly looking forward to hosting her this spring as part of what would have been the first annual Saratoga Book Festival, and I'm so happy that she's here tonight on our computer screens. Thank you, Rachel Eliza.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, David. Thank you, Yaddo. Thank you, Saratoga community. I too is looking forward to the festival. Anytime to return up to Yaddo and Saratoga Springs feels so magical to me. And I'm so happy that we're all gathered here on this kind of overcast Thursday here in New York City anyway, and that I get to read some poems to you from Seeing the Body, which is my new book launched during a pandemic, which gives it quite a birth story, I think. I'd like to read a few poems from the collection. What I can tell you is that this book was written in a sort of two-headed way of the kind of grief of my mother's death and the transformation of myself as a daughter and a woman, as an artist, through that kind of channel, through that journey of grieving. I'd like to begin by showing, what I'll do is I'll read the title poem, Seeing the Body, and while I'm reading, images from the book will appear on your screens if I do this correctly. So the middle section of the collection is all photographs. I'm a poet as much as I am a photographer, and so these things also are joined in the collection. So I'll try it now, and Rachel or David will tell me, they'll let me know if it isn't working. Thank you, everyone. Let's see. So this poem is called Seeing the Body. She died, and in the spring of her blood, I remember my mother's first injury, surprise of unborn petals curling red, then dark around her wrist. Some fruit she cut, some onion, some body with skin and sharp seeds. She fed me. She lived us and I. She lived we and I. She kept speaking with those flowers falling from her blood, taking her across the sky to death. I remember her voice like a horn I never want to pull out of my heart. In the next life, which is here and here, I gather every mouth that ever sang my mother's blues. She burned and she talked back hard at God. Oh, my mother, she danced unbroken too. Bale of grief on my back, opening into something black I wear. A life of flesh, like a petal or fruit or burning. I've carried everything and I'm tired. My mother survived and but she did not live. She told me nothing and she was waiting the entire time. How does the elegy believe me? Together we crossed the sky. There was a gate, and we walked through the world like that. She wrote we and I. She was last or never seen, and I, brown eyes without life, opened her eternity when the air in her stopped, and I. She was last seen dying. My mother was too silent for the first time in her life. The spring of my mother's blood, hot, and God, the dark, dark beyond the closed door that won't move again. Great. So I'll just continue, and later in conversation, I'd love to answer any questions about the photographs or the process of the photographs or the relationship of them to the language versus image in the collection. As I mentioned before, as a visual artist, I'm constantly engaging and overwhelmed by my relationship between visual art and language. And so the next poem I'd like to read to you is an ekphrastic poem. One of the first art collections I saw after my mother's death was a show at the Guggenheim. It was called The Trauma of Painting by the artist Alberto Burri, Italian artist. And I remember kind of wandering through the shell of the Guggenheim and being so struck how this kind of wordless art, this kind of gauze of wounds and injury, but also textures was so striking to me then at that moment. And so this is called Chronology. I don't remember when her name begins in the world. I forget what maiden word the water made against my mother's tongue. Unbroken thirst, black earth, darkness singing blue and green, fruit trees of her hands. Animals roar her blood into bright air, ghosts scrape brown rivers upon her skin. The teeth of the dead tear her unborn words into rafts. My mother's maiden name is Prey. She is a pure being of blood, promise, trouble. Perhaps I was there in the beginning, gaining my own details. Wonder corrodes our armor of ribs and speech, contours breaching the wave that will widow our family. Her breath going down and staying beneath its darkest tongue. The water recalling who the earth believed she was before the God. I want to open my mother's dead hands and listen. Let the human record show our slant of suffering. Let come and rain lash choke cherry leaves with desire, pain, imagination. Show me how the art of losing masters each morning. The mind of the earth turned like a heart after death. Our wounds took the form of night. Our fears rocked like white, tearful waves against the last ships. Our mothers rolled like shells under the raging sea, which means by what I must write in blood. My naked hand labored through the bruised dark to speak, which means language is neither innocent nor free. A woman swells alone inside mauve fields. A grief makes its own blood. The petals beneath me have already changed. The wound of life gave the night endless shame and would not close its mouth. I think sometimes I get used to, kind of reading alone in a room, and waiting for that kind of, that visceral feeling of hearing others, and feeling connected. But I feel connected hearing the language and trying to kind of reach and speak, in my own way towards and through this new medium. I'd like to share another poem with you. This poem is called Belief, and I think it's explanatory. I'd like to read this poem in particular for two people I'm thinking of. Sadly, my family, we lost one of our most beloved uncles to COVID-19 in July, and his name is Uncle Ronald, and I'm reading this poem for him. And just 2 weeks ago, my most beloved aunt, Stephanie, passed away suddenly, and I'm reading this poem in memory of her. I know that each of us is facing our own story of loss, but I'm hoping, and I think I need so deeply to feel that communion, that fellowship of going forward. And so during my life, since I was a small girl, my mother suffered from chronic illness, particularly illness connected to renal failure, kidney failure. And so growing up, I was a constant witness to the strain and ills, but also the strength and resilience of our bodies. This poem is called Belief. I'd come into the room and try to write a different ending on those anonymous walls. There was less time all the time until time changed. You know what I mean. You stare at the clock, the vomit-hued walls, that hush dripping in your head until you feel you have never been elsewhere. Your world is a sigh from the bed, a moan, another request for ice chips, water, some news, any news from the doctor, water again. Where is the doctor? I tried to read and write. Over and over, I arranged plain little soaps, toothbrush, and comb. From home, I brought my mother's own things, hairbrush, Dove and Revlon lipstick, dolled our darling up, washed her weary face, hair twisted into a ballerina's bun. Used the pink lotion the way I was taught, rubbed chemi oil along her scalp while she purred. Yes, yes, thank you, Rachel face. Smoothed thick cream and pulled compression socks on bony feet we once teased her about. My brother gave Evan, the funeral director, a blanket to keep my mother's feet warm, while I fretted about the type of shoes our mother should wear inside of her casket. But before I accepted dying, which would be true 5 months later, I kept trying to write my mother a strong beginning. We slept on the floor of the waiting room. We drank coffee and ate out of foil or boxes. We took shifts, stepping in and out of hell. We never abandoned her. We went out and walked around Jefferson Hospital looking for the right food to put some weight on her smile. Her body was the only home I cared about. I watched red and green lines on screens, wrote out notes and dosages, walked down freakish hallways after midnights. Bodies at unrest, bodies snoring, groaning, farting, cursing, screaming, and sighing in yellow tunnels. Blank and courteous, my uninsurable mind would come back to the same idea. My mother is going to live because she is just going to live. And you know, I would begin the list again, revising the mercy of the God I knew. I dreamt in the hideous chapel, prayers drying desperately on my lips. I'd rub balm against my mother's mouth, hold the straw while she barely sipped, shaking her girlish head if the water wasn't cold enough. Then the pain gripped us too, in the irritated drip beneath her quiet voice. I would speak to her, look into brown eyes that I now see whenever I look into rain. Sometimes I'd hum alone in the middle of the night. I didn't know who I was trying to save anymore. My mother was so close to us, I could almost reach her bad heart, the tired organs stalling in her body. I believed and believed if I took more care with her life, there would be a God who cared more than the God who did not think about our bodies, about the divine grief of daughters, about my mother, or the ache in these stanzas, these too thin veins that still river our lives in blood. And so I think maybe just 3 more. I'm trying to take stock of time and also maybe lift us up a little from the place of grief if I can. So I'd like to share this one poem of mine. It's called Good Mother, and it's part of these kind of, what I call gorgeous miracles, which came in the form of many times people as I was kind of going in and out of these spaces in my life after my mother's death. I met so many kind of like good Samaritans, or I saw something in that thing that you see and you feel like it's for you to see so that you can keep going and take the next breath. So this poem is called Good Mother. And I'm also really happy to say that there's the new Best American Poetry of 2020 is out and about in the world now. And Good Mother is included in that book. It's edited by Paisley Rechdel and David Lehman. So check it out. There's some really wonderful poems in it, and I'm grateful to have Good Mother included. Good Mother. Praise the woman who took me in her arms and wouldn't let go of me. We sank to the floor in the middle of the aisle in Rite Aid. It was a late morning, and I walked slowly, furious that spring could still be so wonderful. Magnolia tempted me to forget about my mother for a few minutes. I stared at a Brooklyn blue sky through branches clasping pear blossoms. The limbs shook in sunlight. My eyes adjusted when I went into the pharmacy and realized everywhere I looked, the world announced it would soon be Mother's Day. Something ripped itself out of me, a howl so wide I thought I would burst. The woman near the counter understood right away. The way my mother once understood I had been born in a specific sadness. The woman did not say she was a mother, but I knew it. She put her arms around me and waved away the cashiers, the security guard who repeated, "Ma'am, ma'am." A stranger rocked me in her arms. So much kindness as we fell over and crashed against a row of votive candles. She didn't say it would be okay. She didn't ask me what was wrong, but her arms put me in a vicious prayer. I almost bit her, almost pushed her away. We held on and praised the nameless thing that makes us what we think we aren't strong enough to know. She knew. She didn't let go of me. Praise the woman who didn't wipe my snot from her shirt, my tears from her collarbone, who did not tell me to pull myself together while everything inside me dropped. Crushed bones, blossoms pushing through my mouth, a word, mom, mom, mom. This broken bird song of mine, with no bird, no wing, no way to fly back through time. Praise the woman who did not leave me like something suddenly dead on the sidewalk with a breeze blowing over its face. Praise the woman who smelled like fabric softener and coffee and the good things I must believe I am too. Praise the mothers who walk slowly through the world, bringing children into themselves, burying children sometimes before themselves, and who defend something harder than innocence. Praise the guts and grace of mothers. Praise their exhaustion and their good work. Praise their wit, their wonderful ways of listening to the world fall asleep against its clean pillow. For the woman who knelt with me in an ugly heap in the middle of Rite Aid on an unbearable spring day, who helped me buy a Mother's Day card for my dead mother, who knew better than to say I'd be just fine. For you, I lift my arms each spring and wish you a kindness so fantastic. I sometimes feel I'm in midair, the shadow of my wings clapping in joy above your children who must love you. And trying to see what time it is. So, how are we with time?
It's 5:25.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you. So
that last poem is incredible. So thank you for it.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
I'm a little bit tearing up.
Thank you. So I think I have time then for 2 more. So the last poem of Seeing the Body is called Good Death. And after my mother's death, there were people I would come across and they would ask me if my mother had a good death. And I kind of, it's a kind of strange question, I think, in that moment for me. In my own ignorance, I didn't know what that had meant because I had never really had such a immediate and visceral death in my own life. I've lost people, but to lose a parent, as any of you who are here with us together knows, that is a specific kind of visceral loss that takes years, if not your lifetime, that you're working through it and it's working through you. But in that immediate few days, it almost can be devouring. And so when I was asked this question, also being a poet and trying to metabolize all these emotions and things that were going through me, this word kept coming back about good death, good death, good death. And finally, I began to kind of look up this phrase and find out that it is kind of an actual kind of notion and concept. And a thing that gave me some comfort was that my mother was able to pass away surrounded by her family, by us, and I was one of the family members kind of holding on to one of her hands. So this poem is called Good Death, and you'll hear me use this phrase. And then I'll read one more poem. I'll just go straight into that, and then look forward to having hopefully questions or things we might share with each other. Yes. Good death. Of words placed in their best black clothes, of that darkness full, of my mother's laughter forged of great dust that spilled its golden light into her tomb, of the copper wreath carved upon her copper vault. God and Mother, I must speak to you. I must say, it is good, our death. Of the ivory city, bones like trumpets blowing my mother away from us in song. Of the city again, where doves and vultures welcome my mother's life. Of the road between her dates, a short slash, a bridge ending in oblivion. But mother, you never end. Of the pronunciation of sorrow, forever mine each astonishing summer, of the snake who suffered our story of knowledge and shame, of the afterlife and its downpour of ordinary rites, of the ordinary rites I enact in my broken thoughts, of my fever waving its anguish until the match goes out in disbelief, of Michael Brown bleeding without mercy beneath the concrete roof of God, God, and God. Of the peace and suffering Black people have been promised, of the clean white clothes I gave my mother's undertaker. Here are the stockings I said, not knowing whether they would match my mother's skin or death. Of the poems I've been trying to write. Die, I say, go elsewhere for songs. Of the food and the appetite of my father's shoulders in a black suit, of the downpour against sunlight, the world and friendship returns my tears, of the wildest animals who charge at me with their horns when I offer my pentameter of ribs, of my mother's visitations, of the messages I have missed, of the hot comb I cradled on my knees in the bathroom, of the brutal gospel of hair, untouched toothbrush, clothes in closets with sales tags, of dreams where my teeth scatter like maple leaves, of what I will never remember. There is no end of remembering, of the rain that makes my howls float like empty bottles of glass, of the dreams where my hot white clothes grow flames, of what I will remember, remembering about love, of the neon-colored nail polish on my mother's hand I held at her deathbed, of what I hated to ask the night and gods, of my knees that remember the orange mud before the grass grew back on her grave, of the strange, concerned question poured like sulfur over my side where I was trying to leave my skin, of it being over again and again, of it beginning. They asked me, was it a good death? Was it a good death? Was there peace for all of us? Why should I want peace instead of my mother? Of the mothers who have always known the ache of the earth while holding children in their wombs. Why didn't you tell me you'd leave me? Now I walk into the sea with my jewel of anguish and shake my mother's these shining human flowers from my bald newborn skull. Thank you. So I think I'll end there.
Yeah.
Is that, I'm a little off with time right now, I apologize. But I think it's always better to not read as long, just our attentions in these screens.
That was just an amazing reading. Thank you so much for it. I found so much of what you shared really moving, so thank you. I wondered if you could actually start off the conversation by talking a little bit about Yaddo and your experience there, since we are partnering with them on this great event.
Absolutely. The first artist residency that I went to after my mother's death was Yaddo. The way that Yaddo lives in me now is something I continually give thanks for. I went in the autumn and I was there for, I want to say maybe 2 months. And it was exactly where I needed to be. Each day I would kind of walk around the lakes, and all the leaves, as everyone who has ever been up in Saratoga Springs, you know, you just get this kind of theater every day of the leaves and the light and the air, and it's kind of crisp, but you get this kind of, it's like childhood, like crunching the leaves as you're walking through them, and you're looking and listening to the world in this new season. And I think that was what was happening to me inside. And so to be in such a place where I felt the presence of so many artists, the artists and writers who were there with me, but then kind of those who had kind of passed through the space of Yaddo and had kind of, you know, left this really amazing kind of residue or magic there. I've also made some really wonderful friends who even now, years later, are still very dear and close to me. Sometimes I long to have breakfast made for me, someone to make me eggs, but you know, those were just, there's this kindness there that I really needed at that point to even begin to work on these poems. As I was trying to write there at Yaddo, you know, language became so difficult for me in this space of grief that I also began to make photographs at the same time. Often, more and more, I learned that it's rare for someone to kind of make images and also really use text in the way that I was using it, or trying to anyway. And what I appreciate about Yaddo too is this encouragement to cross-pollinate, so that it felt normal there. It was normalized, like, you know, talk to a composer, go check out a painting studio, you know, like let all of that kind of flood you and come into you. And so I think it was this ideal arrangement and ordering of nature and space and support that artists always need. And so, you know, even now, sometimes I think I have dreams where I'm walking around the lake and watching the turtles and watching the geese and feeling so grateful that whatever was happening internally in me at that time, that I was in this safe, wonderful space, that I just, you know, I hope one day to go again. I mean, I could spend the rest of my time talking about that, but I'm just utterly grateful to Yaddo. They're completely part of the reason why Seeing the Body is now a book, when it for a long time was just kind of a bunch of cells and a spine and a lot of tears. So thank you, Yaddo, for having me as part of Saratoga and Northshire and everything. I'm very grateful and thankful.
Rachel Eliza, thank you again. Also, I want to follow Rachel and say wonderful reading. Thank you so much. There's a great question here that started us off, I think, in the chat from Mary Ann Newhall saying, could you talk about your process of making photographs and of the wedding of images with words?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for the question. I have always joined images and words probably since I was a young child. And I think many of us in that way that we, you know, books were read to us, picture books, and our own scribblings and trying to kind of illustrate these stories and things. Those seeds were in me for a long time. When I was a younger poet, which seems like centuries ago, I really kept language separated from my process of photographs. Also, when I was younger, I was much more inclined to photograph externally portraits. I particularly focused on portraits of poets and writers because I felt that was a subject in some surface way that I knew and could kind of channel in a way that I felt was interesting to me. I think my first kind of maybe formal photography project involved photographing Cave Canem poets and starting to create a body of an archival body of portraits of black poets. And then by the time I got to, 2014, I had been photographing anything that interested me. And I think even with my photographs, and is such the case with my poems, there's a question or a kind of lyric that I'm engaging, and that's how I will then go toward that both visually or linguistically. I would call myself a lyric poet and a lyric photographer. And so in 2014, specifically about the images I shared, I had finally reached, after more than 10 years, a point where I thought it was probably time for me to turn the camera on myself and to think about the kind of conversation I had always been interested in with other women photographers. Carrie Mae Weems, Lorna Simpson, Francesca Woodman, Anna Mendieta. I mean, there's just all these kind of women photographers, Tina Madadi. I mean, there's even women artists, I would say Joan Mitchell and Louise Bourgeois. There were just these kind of women, fierce women, whose kind of imaging happened through the arts, through paint, through photographs, through sculpture. And I was interested in that kind of feeling of material, and sometimes language feeling inadequate or lacking that kind of tactile energy. And so 2014 in July, I'd gone down to the South, specifically to Mississippi, and had begun to make these self-portraits because I wanted to think about nature again, the land, the landscape, the sky, like a lot of the photographs are like, it's wood, stone, water, very natural elements, as you saw, desert, trees, and to place myself as I am placed in that landscape and to see what was possible by working through both mediums in those spaces. When I first was working on Seeing the Body, the photographs weren't part of my, they weren't, I wouldn't have considered including them as part of the book. I figured the production would be, something that poetry publishers would run away from me screaming like, wait, photographs, and also, to have them as their own section without any kind of explanatory material, that they're not an illustration, but that they are a language. As I was able to work more and more on the poems, I realized that it would be impossible to write Seeing the Body without including these images, because they are a visual marker, a visual tableau of what happened to me immediately, and what I was interested in immediately before my mother's passing. And then, about a year to a year and a half after she died, tracking myself and kind of where I was in the world and how I felt about this kind of self-image. And so, I think I just gave such a rambling answer, but I think I really needed to have both of those languages to put together this particular book. But I like the mess. I like that it's messy and complicated, and that in myself now, I don't try to make a distinction between what language or what medium. I let them run and bleed and spill into each other. I'm writing a novel now, actually, and it is not interested in poetry or photography. So I'm in a different place. But I think I'm hoping that might offer some reply to this wonderful question that I was asked.
Thank you. I think it really does. I want to continue with that, actually. In your author's note, you call the photographs, you say they function as a map of the self. And what's similar about composing a photograph and composing a poem? Do you share kind of artistic processes that are in both, or do you do you find yourself making certain aesthetic choices in both that are sort of the same kind of thing?
Absolutely. I mean, I definitely think the vocabulary for myself that I use for, my practice as a photographer and painter is similar to what I would use as a poet. How a poem is framed, how it is cropped, poems are cropped. I mean, the precision of a poet, to really cut and sculpt language to make it so exact feels similar to me when, I'm walking in the city or I'm in a place and there's one particular thing that I am using my lens to focus on. And so out of all the noise and energy and pictures around me that I could make, what is it in me that focuses on like that one window or the profile of somebody in shadow when there are all these people rushing by? Like, what is that thing that my own imagination has snagged on? A lot of my poems have the kind of presence of light and darkness, whether that is literal light and dark in the poem or whether that is a kind of internal lighting or darkening, as it might seem like for myself or the emotion that I'm thinking about. Poems have angles to them, but they also can be, they can really refract things. They are in some way, although it might sound kind of sentimental or corny, they are a kind of lens that can be macro. I mean, nature, when poets write about nature and they focus on like this weird, like 6 eyeball of an insect, it's like, who looks at that? It's like, well, poets do. We love that. We love like why birds mate this one way and on this one island and like 3 people have ever seen this. Like, that's the thing we kind of run around screaming, like we've all seen unicorns. And so, there's also a thing more seriously about poetry too, which is about memory. And I think there is a clear bridge for me between memory of language and memory of image. The photographs and seeing the body that show me just days before my mother died, I can never be that woman again. I look at those pictures of myself, I can see that it's the same body. I don't have a different body per se, but I cannot get back to that consciousness. I cannot get back to a certain kind of innocence of that woman who was down in the South trying to see herself and trying to leave a record and trying to think about the relationship of her body in the South to America, to race, to queerness, to identity. I can't get back to that particular conversation. And yet my desire after my mother's death was, I'm not going to be able to remember everything that is happening so intensely to me. So I have to lean almost like a third or fourth eye, almost like a second or third tongue on my camera, because I can't even talk about this. It's like unsayable and inarticulate. And so I definitely feel that for me, there is a strong relationship that is more and more strengthening for me as I lean and trust it more, that exists between, my process. And when my poems fail, my photographs can fail sometimes too. The light was wrong. I was looking at the wrong thing, or the shutter speed, I should have done it this way or that way. And I like those experiments. I like when that happens. I like a photo that I thought needed to be really clear ends up blurry and messed up, and I'm like, oh, it's a haunted image. That's what it was supposed to be, not this like perfect thing. And so that experimentation too, for me, gives so much discovery that, it's all practice, and I enjoy it.
There's a wonderful question in the chat from Claire. She asks, do you find that there's a shift or a change in the ebb and flow of your grief when you share your poems in a reading, your poems from this book specifically?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat it, Rachel? I didn't.
Of course. Do you find that there's a shift or a change in the ebb and flow of your grief when you see the body in a reading?
It's a good question. Thank you, Claire. So, I mean, this book would have come out in June. I'm thinking particularly about this book because I don't have any other pandemic book, and I hope I never will, and none of us ever will. But, there's a thing that, I think I go through kind of weather right now. Some evenings or some days, I set up my ring lights and I sit here and I'm craving these little boxes just to see faces and people, like that they're alive and safe in an environment in their home, that there's like air around them. And like, that's even a way for me to feel comforted and reassured that people are surviving. There are other times where I feel inconsolable when I close my laptop and I'm sitting here and I'll be alone. And I'll be alone with this language, and it'll still have its kind of like alchemy happening, but it will kind of like just drops. It's almost like something hitting a wall and it just drops down. I think I'm doing the best that I can with such raw poems. The material is so raw and personal for me that to share it through a screen has its pros and cons. I still feel very vulnerable. I still feel suddenly like sweaty and like, oh my gosh, I'm reading this stuff and it's so depressing or it's sad. And I hope I can make people smile or something. But I think the thing too that I feel that the question asked for me, and this would happen whether there was a pandemic or not, if I were in a room with people, it almost would be this kind of this moodiness. I am very, very much a big jazz person. I love jazz. I love kind of the improvisational kind of energy of riffing. So what I like when I'm reading my poems is that I can never read them with my voice anyway, the same exact way that I would read them. Because I know at this moment I am particularly sweet on Yaddo, as I would say, and particularly feel that they're in the book with me. It's almost like reading to a friend or a kind of a confidant who helped me come through. And so I know right now as I'm sitting here with you all, I'm very open and I feel very vulnerable and I feel almost a little tearful because I can see this kind of shadow of me walking along underneath these trees and wondering if I was going to make it. And so I think there's a thing where sometimes, it's like if you're in person and you're listening to music or you're listening to a singer or you're looking at art, that buzzing that goes through you, sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not, And so, today it's there. I really feel it. And I'm thankful to all of you for us holding space because I really feel fluttery. And I think the day that I would feel kind of jaded and bored about reading, even through a screen, I probably should stop reading because I need to feel it in my body. I'm very much about embodiment. And so it's very much sitting inside me, the language and this communion that we're having, even the terms on which we're having it still matter to me.
Thank you. There's a connection in your work between the body and language. So from the title through the photographs, you mentioned it earlier. It feels like to me as a reader, the grief of the sharpness of your pain kind of moves you in the poems to break down, for language itself to break down, to become ungrammatical. And then in your later poem, Signs, there's the physical and the linguistic both come together as you yourself are changing. Can you talk about this connection between bodies and words?
Yes. First, I would probably talk about how fluid and porous words are in my own relationship to my body. And I think also I would also bring in my particular photographs of trying to kind of circle my own body and my own mortality in a way of memory making, but also like wordlessness of things that are articulate. The poem Signs you mentioned in particular is one of my least favorite poems in Seeing the Body because it was one of the most painful things I've ever written. I mean, I really felt like I had like cinder blocks tied around my feet and I had been dropped into a river and had to like kick out from the current to get myself toward something that I would call a poem. Its original title was called Magic. And I thought, oh, you're being cute. Like that's not going to work. And so it became signs. I never submitted it anywhere. It just brings me a lot of anguish. I don't think I've even read it aloud yet because it's just so raw, and each word, I had written a lot of words and things around that particular poem, and then found myself just striking them out and just saying, like, you've got to show up and be real. And that's what I think words do. And at the same time, words give me a space where if I say blue, and I say blue to all of us, or I say good, or I say light, or I say dark, we can come toward an entrance together with midnight blue, sky blue, Basquiat blue, Joan Mitchell blue. We can come with our own story of blue or light or dark, and like still be connected to each other. And so I think the words in my body also give me they give me windows. They don't cut me off from myself. They let me go through these windows and spaces into something deeper. If I say bone, the poet then says, which bone? What does the bone remember? What can't the bone say? What are the other words for bone? Another word for bone is mother. Another word for bone is Melissa. If I think of my heart, who are those people that make my heart? It's a muscle, but it's not, and so it's just this kind of orbit that happens for me where, it feels very molecular and cellular. My need and compulsion, the compulsion, kind of oxygen and air that the words are. And I think that all of us now, as we're going toward poetry, we're diving for air. We're going into these pages, into language, into poetry, into art, and we need to breathe. We need air. I mean, literally on the West Coast, there's no air. The skies are on fire. They're burning. They're orange. It's an orange I never want to see. It's awful. And so it's like that air. What is the word for that? And who is responsible? And so, I think if you ask me the same amazing question 5 minutes from now, I tell you something different. And I think that's what I like about that question, actually. So thank you.
Thanks. I think when you bring up breathing there, and I think we turn to art for that kind of breath. And it made me think that you've got two poems in this book titled Myth, and in Good Death, you brought up Michael Brown, and murdered in 7 days, as you said, after your mother's death. It's like you're taking the word myth from the classical one in the first one with Eurydice, and then transforming it into something greater that I think really speaks to us right now. And I can't help but observe that the writing of your book stretches from Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Philando Castile to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Jacob Blake and Kenosha. That's not really a question, but I think.
Well, I mean, I could say something. I think I'm exhausted with almost. I don't think there is a book I've written that doesn't have a kind of obituary of Black life in it, and I'm exhausted and enraged by that. My last book, Lighting the Shadow, that came out, or while I was writing it, Trayvon Martin was killed, and that became kind of the first thing. But even before that, I think I could find in my other books, except one, this kind of specter, this figure. To lose my mother in August of 2014, or our family, we buried her in the very, very beginning of August, and 7 days later, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And so you have this collision of a very private grief and pain with then a national and public grief. When Norton said, oh, okay, your book's going to come out in like June of 2020. I'm like, well, everyone's going to be on the beach. No one's going to want to like read this kind of depressive, sad book, political book. And I had no idea that, this book would unfortunately be immediately in these conversations, and that my sadness about this book is that these poems still need to be written, and that this continues. You know, back when my mother died, that was around the first time I began to actively take to the street, protest, and I actually thought, I'm willing to put my body out in the street at this point. If I get arrested, if I get gassed, I don't care, but I cannot see another picture of someone's child filled with bullets, choked, dragged, shot. I cannot abide it. I cannot. And so, you know, as I'm writing this book, grieving a very personal loss, I couldn't ignore also what was happening all around me, and in the various roles of being a daughter, being a teacher, being an artist, being a Black woman. These things all come together. They're not isolated. And so that is why, you know, sadly, they are part of the voices that come together, part of my own voice, you know, and seeing the body, you know, the poem about going down to Washington and seeing Emmett Till's actual casket in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And just sitting there looking at it and thinking, we still can't bury Emmett Till. He still can't have peace. Every year it's just Emmett Till, and it's awful, and it's sad, and shame on us. When I was in the South, I went to Money, Mississippi. I went to the ruins of the Bryant store. So I would have muscle memory to actually write in an accurate way what the sky in Money, Mississippi actually looks like, and what that sun feels like on my Black skin. And so that is part of the work in my own identity and practice of being a witness, but also being an artist and being a citizen. That matters to me.
Rachel Eliza, thank you so much. I believe we're out of time, and this is a great note to end on. Thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Yaddo, and great event.
Yes, Rachel Eliza, thank you for that remarkable reading and for letting us hold space with you tonight. It was really a lovely night. Thank you to all the audience. Hopefully we'll see you at another Northshire Live event coming up soon. We have 2 more great Yaddo events this month. Maza Mengist the week after next, which is going to be amazing. And then Timothy Weiner at the end of the month. So please come on back. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your evening. Thank you so much, Rachel Eliza.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.